What's up guys, it's me Jeremy. Individual champion mechanics have definitely become one of my favorite things to make videos about recently, and there's a lot to learn about the way a champion is designed and the thought process that goes into them when you break it down into the individual mechanics, since champions really aren't made all at once. Usually every individual thing is kind of just developed on its own one at a time. So by studying these mechanics, we get a huge insight as to how Riot'S design champions. Today we're looking at Riot's new mechanic, which is the cripple, also known as the grounded mechanic. And a huge shout out goes to ProGuides.com for helping me out with the editing on this video today. They recently released a new service that allows you to ask questions to higher ranked players and get a response almost instantly actually. And I think it's pretty damn cool, but you don't have to take it from me because they actually have a free trial that gets you full access, so you can check them out and decide for yourself if you like it or not. And without further ado, let's get started. So the mechanic that I'm referring to, just for those who don't know, goes by the name of cripple, or the grounded effect. But I'll be referring to it as the cripple mechanic for the rest of the video just because it sounds a little bit better than saying grounded. And what this mechanic is a new form of crowd control that allows you to still do everything when you're affected by it except for casting mobility spells. You can still move, you can still use your abilities, you just can't use things like flash, stuff like Ahri's ultimate, LeBlanc's distortion, etc. This is a fairly new mechanic to League of Legends, and we first saw it in what was, I believe, the Poppy rework, and we're seeing it again in the Cassiopeia rework and kind of somewhat on Talia, but she has a different interaction to the cripple mechanic. And I have to say that this is a really interesting way to design a mechanic for a champion. Designs like this that we can see in the cripple effect and some other mechanics have always intrigued me because it's the type of mechanical design that is very on edge. It's a very risky way or risky type of thing to design for in a mechanic actually. And the reason why I say this is because it's the kind of mechanic that has a very situational effect. It's very sink or swim. It's quite similar to something like the cleanse mechanic, which depending on your situation can be just crazy strong and just totally counter the heck out of someone, or be totally useless. Sometimes it's also somewhere in between, but it's a lot more volatile design than other mechanics since it relies so heavily on countering something. And designing something to be good for the sole sake of countering something else isn't really ideal. You want things to be good in their own way and in their own right, and a mechanic like cripple that is situational doesn't entirely do that, at least on paper. And cripple especially is a tough mechanic to design for because a lot of champions in League of Legends rely on mobility to function. It's a super core part of their kit, while other champions don't even have any mobility in their spells at all, and as a result there's a lot of extremes involved and it's a risky type of thing to put on a champion. However, with that said, the way the cripple mechanic has been introduced into League of Legends is actually pretty good. The current form that cripple exists so far in the game is that it is used in a way that develops a style of play for the champion that relies on someone not using mobility on you. It's more developed as an entire play style. It's not really used as a way to shut out and counterpick champions, more just a way to allow a certain champion to at least somewhat rely on their opponent not being mobile in a fight. It's totally true that cripple is kind of useless versus champions that don't have mobility, but with the way the cripple is implemented in the game, the champions that have access to the cripple effect just straight up don't need their cripple effect versus someone who is immobile, and it's actually pretty smart. So the cripple effect is designed, at least at the moment, to give a champion the ability to guarantee that their opponent cannot use a mobility spell as an escape, and therefore allows you to have this short-range playstyle that also lacks mobility. And this happens because the cripple effect is never the core mechanic of a champion's kit. Cassiopeia is a great example of this, and I think she makes great use of the cripple mechanic. It totally makes sense for Cassiopeia to have a cripple since she's immobile and she's skill shot based, so someone with mobility would typically have a very easy time in lane versus her and just in general. So having a cripple on her is super awesome, but it's also not that important for her. She doesn't entirely rely on the cripple to be successful at all. It's kind of just like this bonus thing that she has. It's not a core part of her gameplay pattern or her damage combos. The cripple is just kind of slapped on in a way where it's just kind of there. However, with that said, it's totally true at the moment that Cassiopeia does have a lot of problems though, and I can't really ignore those. And I also can't say that the way that her actual cripple ability itself in the way that it's implemented is good. It's more the fact that they actually put a cripple on Cassiopeia in general, which I see as a very solid design decision for her playstyle. And the reason why this is so awesome is because this type of implementation allows the cripple effect to exist on a champion without really punishing them for being in a situation that makes it useless. If Cassiopeia plays against someone who is immobile, she just kind of doesn't need the cripple effect anyway, and since it's not a huge part of her gameplay pattern, it doesn't matter that it's useless really at all. She can totally just afford to not take advantage of it, because the advantage that Cassiopeia gets from her opponent being immobile in the first place is enough to outweigh the disadvantage from the cripple effect in her kit being useless in that matchup. And so by implementing it on champions that already perform well versus immobile champions, you allow the mechanic to exist in a way where it is good in situations where it's applicable, but when you're in a situation where it's not applicable, it doesn't matter, because you get an advantage from the matchup in a different way. It's a great solution to champions that have taken hits in the meta due to mobility creep, and I really like the decision to put it in Cassiopeia, although I can't really say if the actual ability is good or bad. Just the fact that Cassiopeia now has a cripple in general on a basic ability is awesome, and it makes a lot of sense. And to put it in the words of the champion designers Ride Meddler and Ride Xenon, they believe that cripple is a really solid mechanic that has a lot of potential. It's not really a question of if it should be implemented, just more a question of when and where to put this mechanic on someone. And now that they have some tangible versions of it, we'll probably start to see it being introduced a lot more on new champions, on reworks, and I think they mentioned they were experimenting with it being on an item active effect. That's definitely an interesting thing to consider, maybe even putting it on like Exhaust or something like that, maybe a totally new summoner spell. Cripple's an interesting mechanic that definitely has a place on more than just Poppy and Cassiopeia though, so I'm interested to see where it's headed in the future. However, with that said, it's still a very risky mechanic because of the other end of the extreme. Sure, because of the way that it's implemented, the extreme where cripple totally sucks pretty much just doesn't matter, or at least it shouldn't matter, but on the opposite end of the spectrum, you still have to address the situation where cripple just totally wrecks and just hard counters and just destroys a champion if you land it. And once again, that type of gameplay is at risk as well, since it's not really a fair way to design it if you just automatically hard counter someone. Every champion needs to be good and bad in their own way with their own weaknesses and strengths. Their merit should never be based on the ability of another champion to counter them, whether it's good or bad. Sure, it can totally be a factor, but Riot doesn't want people to say, you know, like, why the heck would you ever play X champion? Because if you just play against Y, there's totally nothing you could do. They don't want that, and then as a result, this extreme on the other end of the spectrum isn't entirely acceptable either. And with that, now we can finally come to the actual way that it's implemented in the game, at least so far. Since there are champions that completely rely on mobility, and it's not really possible to make someone who totally relies on cripple, the effect has to be interactive in the way that it's implemented. It cannot be a targeted debuff or something like that with little to no outplay potential, without putting it at risk of being too hard of a counter mechanic. And so with Cassiopeia and Poppy, it's restricted to very specific ranges. That's why Cassiopeia's new W has a minimum range to it, why it's a skill shot, and it's why Poppy's W has a very set range and is generally a predictable effect. Now, if you were to implement it on Exhaust or maybe on an item, it's probably not going to be a good idea. It would just be too powerful in the very specific situations where it's actually good, and it really wouldn't be fair to the mobile champions. Making the mechanic accessible to everyone really changes the design of it as well. It changes cripple from something that a champion uses to make their playstyle more viable versus mobile champions, into something that you just kind of opt into to make the opponent's playstyle weaker. And designing it to make certain champions weaker is not really a smart thing. Imagine if you implemented an item that gives you a cripple effect in the game tomorrow, for example. Every single champion that is mobile would become weaker as an indirect result, and the ones that totally rely on mobility, like the assassins, would probably become almost unplayable, or at least experience massive drops in win rate. And so something that makes the mechanic accessible to literally everyone is probably not a manageable way to implement the mechanic. However, what might be possible is to implement it onto a specific champion in a way that is less interactive, like a single target, targeted ability. You would just have to make it so that the game plan of the champion revolves around the cripple mechanic and disrupting and stuff. Like, you wouldn't be able to have an uninteractive cripple ability and kill pressure on the target exist on the same champion. You either have the interactive cripple effect on someone like Poppy or Cassiopeia, or you put it on someone in an uninteractive way that lacks the kill pressure and damage completely. So if you put it on like Janna or something. So on like a disruptive, supporty kind of character, it's potentially doable. It does make the situation where the cripple mechanic is useless a lot more impactful though, but it's an interesting design thing to think about for a potential new way to implement the mechanic. As well though, it's still a defined mechanic, and giving it exclusivity is kind of important to keeping those champions unique, and giving it to everyone also adds in the risk of making the champions who have the cripple effect in their kit specifically become a little bit obsolete. I'll use the example Riot Xenon did when describing this situation. For example, if you had an effect like Braum's Unbreakable, his E, and you put that effect on an item with like a 40-second cooldown, that makes Braum a lot less special and a lot less interesting and just fun and unique, and that really sucks for Braum. So once again with items, it's probably not a good idea to implement that effect, and when implementing effects on items, they have to either be super generic effects, like just applying a slow or dealing damage, or they have to be super specific and niche effects that exist for a specific purpose, but in a different way than it does on the champions. For example, Zhonya's Hourglass doesn't make Kaele's ultimate feel obsolete at all, since they're implemented in very different ways, and Kaele's ultimate is also vastly superior to Zhonya's. So I guess it is maybe possible to implement the cripple mechanic on an item, but it would definitely have to be in a way that is vastly inferior to the versions that exist on champions like Cassiopeia and Poppy. Anyway, that just about wraps up my thoughts and my talk on this video for it today. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the talk about the cripple mechanic. I for one think it's super cool and interesting whenever Riot implements a new mechanic on a champion. And if you guys enjoyed the video, hit that like button, and if you didn't hit that dislike, subscribe if you want. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.